Chapter 1 of Book 10 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 10, the 5th of June, 1832. Chapter 1. The surface of the question. Of what is revolt composed? Of nothing and of everything. Of an electricity disengaged little by little. Of a flame suddenly darting forth. Of a wandering force. Of a passing breath. This breath encounters heads which speak, brains which dream, souls which suffer, passions which burn, wretchedness which howls, and bears them away. Whither? At random. Athwart the state, the laws, athwart prosperity and the insolence of others. Irritated convictions, embittered enthusiasms, agitated indignations, instincts of war which have been repressed, youthful courage which has been exalted, generous blindness, curiosity, the taste for change, the thirst for the unexpected, the sentiment which causes one to take pleasure in reading the posters for the new play, and love, the prompter's whistle at the theatre, the vague hatreds, rancours, disappointments, every vanity which thinks that destiny has bankrupted it, discomfort, empty dreams, ambitious that are hedged about, whoever hopes for a downfall, some outcome, in short at the very bottom, the rabble, that mud which catches fire, such are the elements of revolt, that which is grandest and that which is basest, the beings who prowl outside of all bounds, awaiting an occasion, bohemians, vagrants, vagabonds of the crossroads, those who sleep at night in a desert of houses with no other roof than the cold clouds of heaven, those who, each day, demand their bread from chance and not from toil, the unknown of poverty and nothingness, the bare-armed, the bare-footed, belong to revolt. Whoever cherishes in his soul a secret revolt against any deed whatever on the part of the state, of life or of fate, is ripe for riot, and as soon as it makes its appearance he begins to quiver, and to feel himself borne away with the whirlwind. Revolt is a sort of water-spout in the social atmosphere which forms suddenly in certain conditions of temperature, and which, as it eddies about, mounts, descends, thunders, tears, raises, crushes, demolishes, uproots, bearing with it great natures and small, the strong man and the feeble mind, the tree trunk and the stalk of straw. Woe to him whom it bears away, as well as to him whom it strikes. It breaks the one against the other. It communicates to those whom it seizes an indescribable and extraordinary power. It fills the first comer with the force of events. It converts everything into projectiles. It makes a cannonball of a rough stone and a general of a porter. If we are to believe certain oracles of crafty political views, a little revolt is desirable from the point of view of power. System, revolt strengthens those governments which it does not overthrow. It puts the army to the test. It consecrates the bourgeoisie. It draws out the muscles of the police. It demonstrates the force of the social framework. It is an exercise in gymnastics. It is almost hygiene. Power is in better health after a revolt, as a man is after a good rubbing down. Revolt, 30 years ago, was regarded from still other points of view. There is for everything a theory which proclaims itself good sense. Philintus against Alcestis. Mediation offered between the false and the true. Explanation, admonition, rather haughty extenuation which, because it is mingled with blame and excuse, thinks itself wisdom, and is often only pedantry. A whole political school called the golden mean has become the outcome of this. As between cold water and hot water, it is the lukewarm water party. This school with its false depth, all on the surface, which dissects effects without going back to first causes, chides from its height of a demi-science the agitation of the public square. If we listen to this school, the riots which complicated the affair of 1830 deprived that great event of a portion of its purity. The Revolution of July had been a fine popular gale, abruptly followed by blue sky. They made the cloudy sky reappear. They caused that revolution, at first so remarkable for its unanimity, to degenerate into a quarrel. In the Revolution of July, as in all progress accomplished by fits and starts, there had been secret fractures. These riots rendered them perceptible. It might have been said, this is broken. After the Revolution of July, one was sensible only of deliverance. After the riots, one was conscious of a catastrophe. All revolt closes the shops, depresses the funds, throws the exchange into consternation, suspends commerce, clogs business, precipitates failures. No more money, private fortunes rendered uneasy, Public credit shaken, industry disconcerted, capital withdrawing, work at a discount, fear everywhere, countershocks in every town, hence gulfs. It has been calculated that the first day of a riot cost France 20 millions, the second day 40, the third 60. A 3 days uprising cost 120 millions. That is to say, if only the financial result be taken into consideration, it is equivalent to a disaster, a shipwreck or a lost battle which should annihilate a fleet of 60 ships of the line. No doubt, historically, uprisings have their beauty. The War of the Pavements is no less grandiose and no less pathetic than the War of Thickets. In the one there is the soul of forests, in the other the heart of cities. The one has Jean Chouin, the other has a Jean. Revolts have illuminated with a red glare all the most original points of the Parisian character: generosity, devotion, stormy gaiety, students proving that bravery forms part of intelligence, the National Guard invincible, bivouacs of shopkeepers, fortresses of street urchins, contempt of death on the part of passers-by. Schools and legions clashed together. After all, between the combatants there was only a difference of age. The race is the same. It is the same stoical men who died at the age of 20 for their ideas, at 40 for their families. The army, always a sad thing in civil wars, opposed prudence to audacity. Uprisings, while proving popular intrepidity, also educated the courage of the bourgeois. This is well, but is all this worth the bloodshed? And to the bloodshed add the future darkness, progress compromised, uneasiness among the best men, honest liberals in despair, foreign absolutism happy in these wounds dealt to revolution by its own hand, the vanquished of 1830 triumphing and saying, "We told you so." Add Paris enlarged, possibly, but France most assuredly diminished. Add, for all must needs be told, the massacres which have too often dishonoured the victory of order grown ferocious over liberty gone mad. To sum up all, uprisings have been disastrous. Thus speaks that approximation to wisdom with which the bourgeoisie, that approximation to the people, so willingly contents itself. For our part, we reject this word uprisings as too large, and consequently as too convenient. We make a distinction between one popular movement and another popular movement. We do not inquire whether an uprising costs as much as a battle. Why a battle in the first place? Here the question of war comes up. Is war less of a scourge than an uprising is of a calamity? And then, are all uprisings calamities? And what if the revolt of July did cost 120 millions? The establishment of Philip V in Spain cost France 2 millions. Even at the same price, we should prefer the 14th of July. However, we reject these figures, which appear to be reasons and which are only words. An uprising being given, we examine it by itself. In all that is said by the doctrinarian objection above presented, there is no question of anything but effect. We seek the cause. We will be explicit. End of Book 10, Chapter 1. Recording by Kate Mackenzie.
Book 10 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caitlin Tetmeyer. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 10, the 5th of June, 1832. Chapter 2, The Root of the Matter. There is such a thing as an uprising, and there is such a thing as insurrection. These are two separate phases of wrath. One is in the wrong, the other is in the right. In democratic states, the only ones which are founded on justice, it sometimes happens that the fraction usurps. Then the whole rises, and the necessary claim of its rights may proceed as far as resort to arms. In all questions which result from collective sovereignty, the war of the whole against the fraction is insurrection. The attack of the fraction against the whole is revolt. According as the Tuileries contain a king or the Convention, they are justly or unjustly attacked. The same cannon, pointed against the populace, is wrong on the 10th of August and right on the 14th of Vendemiaire. Alike in appearance, fundamentally different in reality, the Swiss defend the false, Bonaparte defends the true. That which universal suffrage has effected in its liberty and in its sovereignty cannot be undone by the street. It is the same in things pertaining purely to civilization. The instinct of the masses, clear-sighted today, may be troubled tomorrow. The same fury legitimate when directed against Hooray, and absurd when directed against Turgot. The destruction of machines, the pillage of warehouses, the breaking of rails, the demolition of docks, the false roots of multitudes, the refusal by the people of justice to progress, Remus assassinated by students, Rousseau driven out of Switzerland and stoned, that is revolt. Israel against Moses, Athens against Phocion, Rome against Cicero, that is an uprising. Paris against the Bastille, that is insurrection. The soldiers against Alexander, the sailors against Christopher Columbus, this is the same revolt, impious revolt. Why? Because Alexander is doing for Asia with the sword that which Christopher Columbus is doing for America with the compass. Alexander, like Columbus, is finding a world. These gifts of a world to civilization are such augmentations of light that all resistance in that case is culpable. Sometimes the populace counterfeits fidelity to itself. The masses are traitors to the people. Is there, for example, anything stranger than that long and bloody protest of dealers in contraband salt, a legitimate chronic revolt, which at the decisive moment, on the day of salvation, at the very hour of popular victory, espouses the throne, turns into chouannerie, and, from having been an insurrection against, becomes an uprising for, somber masterpieces of ignorance? The contraband salt dealer escapes the royal gibbets, and with a rope's end round his neck mounts the white cockade. Death to the salt duties brings forth, "Long live the king!" The assassins of Saint Barthélemy, the cutthroats of September, the manslaughterers of Avignon, the assassins of Coligny, the assassins of Madame Lamballe, the assassins of Brune, Michelet, Verdets, Cadenets, the companions of Jehu, the chevaliers of Brossard, behold an uprising. La Vendée is a grand Catholic uprising. The sound of right in movement is recognizable. It does not always proceed from the trembling of excited masses. There are mad rages, there are cracked bells, all tocsins do not give out the sound of bronze. The brawl of passions and ignorances is quite another thing from the shock of progress. Show me in what direction you are going. Rise, if you will, but let it be that you may grow great. There is no insurrection except in a forward direction. Any other sort of rising is bad. Every violent step towards the rear is a revolt. To retreat is to commit a deed of violence against the human race. Insurrection is a fit of rage on the part of truth. The pavements which the uprising disturbs give forth the spark of right. These pavements bequeath to the uprising only their mud. Danton against Louis XIV is insurrection. Hébert against Danton is revolt. Hence it results that if insurrection in given cases may be, as Lafayette says, the most holy of duties, an uprising may be the most fatal of crimes. There is also a difference in the intensity of heat. Insurrection is often a volcano. Revolt is often only a fire of straw. Revolt, as we have said, is sometimes found among those in power. Polignac is a rioter. Camille Desmoulins is one of the governing powers. Insurrection is sometimes resurrection. The solution of everything by universal suffrage being an absolutely modern fact, and all history anterior to this fact being, for the space of 4,000 years, filled with violated right, and the suffering of peoples, each epoch of history brings with it that protest of which it is capable. Under the Caesars there was no insurrection, but there was juvenile. The facit indignatio replaces the Gracchi. Under the Caesars there is the exile to Syene. There is also the man of the Annales. We do not speak of the immense exile of Patmos, who, on his part also, overwhelms the real world with a protest in the name of the ideal world, who makes of his vision an enormous satire and casts on Rome Nineveh, on Rome Babylon, on Rome Sodom, the flaming reflection of the apocalypse. John on his rock is the Sphinx on its pedestal. We may understand him, he is a Jew, and it is Hebrew, but the man who writes the Annales is of the Latin race. Let us rather say he is a Roman. As the Neros reign in a black way, they should be painted to match. The work of the graving tool alone would be too pale. There must be poured into the channel a concentrated prose which bites. Despots count for something in the question of philosophers. A word that is chained is a terrible word. The writer doubles and trebles his style when silence is imposed on a nation by its master. From this silence there arises a certain mysterious plenitude which filters into thought and there congeals into bronze. The compression of history produces conciseness in the historian. The granite solidity of such and such a celebrated prose is nothing but the accumulation effected by the tyrant. Tyranny constrains the writer to conditions of diameter which are augmentations of force. The Ciceronian period, which hardly sufficed for Verus, would be blunted on Caligula. The less spread of sail in the phrase, the more intensity in the blow. Tacitus thinks with all his might. The honesty of a great heart, condensed in justice and truth, overwhelms as with lightning. Be it remarked in passing that Tacitus is not historically superposed upon Caesar. The Tiberii were reserved for him. Caesar and Tacitus are two successive phenomena, a meeting between whom seems to be mysteriously avoided by the one who, when he sets the centuries on the stage, regulates the entrances and the exits. Caesar is great, Tacitus is great. God spares these two greatnesses by not allowing them to clash with one another. The guardian of justice, in striking Caesar, might strike too hard and be unjust. God does not will it. The great wars of Africa and Spain, the pirates of Sicily destroyed, civilization introduced into Gaul, into Brittany, into Germany, all this glory covers the Rubicon. There is here a sort of delicacy of the divine justice, hesitating to let loose upon the illustrious usurper the formidable historian, sparing Caesar Tacitus, and according extenuating circumstances to genius. Certainly, despotism remains despotism, even under the despot of genius. There is corruption under all illustrious tyrants, but the moral pest is still more hideous under infamous tyrants. In such reigns, nothing veils the shame, and those who make examples, Tacitus as well as Juvenal, slap this ignominy which cannot reply in the face more usefully in the presence of all humanity. Rome smells worse under Vitellius than under Sylla. Under Claudius and under Domitian there is a deformity of baseness corresponding to the repulsiveness of the tyrant. The villainy of slaves is a direct product of the despot. A miasma exhales from these cowering consciences wherein the master is reflected. Public powers are unclean, hearts are small, consciences are dull, souls are like vermin. Thus it is under Caracalla, thus it is under Commodus, thus it is under Heliogabalus, while from the Roman Senate under Caesar there comes nothing but the odor of the dung which is peculiar to the Ares of the eagles. Hence the advent, apparently tardy, of the Tacituses and the Juvenals. It is in the hour for evidence that the demonstrator makes his appearance. But Juvenal and Tacitus, like Isaiah in biblical times, like Dante in the Middle Ages, is man. Riot and insurrection are the multitude, which is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. In the majority of cases, riot proceeds from a material fact. Insurrection is always a moral phenomenon. Riot is Masaniello, insurrection Spartacus. Insurrection borders on mind, riot on the stomach. Gaster grows irritated, but Gaster assuredly is not always in the wrong. In questions of famine, riot, Buzanque, for example, holds a true, pathetic, and just point of departure. Nevertheless, it remains a riot. Why? It is because, right at bottom, it was wrong in form. Shy although in the right, violent although strong, it struck at random. It walked like a blind elephant. It left behind it the corpses of old men, of women, and of children. It wished the blood of inoffensive and innocent persons without knowing why. The nourishment of the people is a good object. To massacre them is a bad means. All armed protest, even the most legitimate, even that of the 10th of August, even that of July 14th, begin with the same troubles. Before the right gets set free, there is foam and tumult. In the beginning, the insurrection is a riot, just as a river is a torrent. Ordinarily, it ends in that ocean, revolution. Sometimes, however, coming from those lofty mountains which dominate the moral horizon, justice, wisdom, reason, right, formed of the pure snow of the ideal, after a long fall from rock to rock, after having reflected the sky in its transparency and increased by 100 affluents in the majestic mien of triumph, insurrection is suddenly lost in some quagmire, as the Rhine is in a swamp. All this is of the past. The future is another thing. Universal suffrage has this admirable property that it dissolves riot in its inception, and by giving the vote to insurrection, it deprives it of its arms. The disappearance of wars, of street wars as well as of wars on the frontiers, such is the inevitable progression. Whatever today may be, tomorrow will be peace. However, insurrection, riot, and points of difference between the former and the latter, the bourgeois, properly speaking, knows nothing of such shades. In his mind, all is sedition, rebellion pure and simple, the revolt of the dog against his master, an attempt to bite whom must be punished by the chain and the kennel, barking, snapping, until such day as the head of the dog, suddenly enlarged, is outlined vaguely in the gloom face to face with the lion. Then the bourgeois shouts, "Long live the people!" This explanation given, what does the movement of June 1832 signify so far as history is concerned? Is it a revolt? Is it an insurrection? It may happen to us, in placing this formidable event on the stage, to say revolt now and then, but merely to distinguish superficial facts and always preserving the distinction between revolt, the form, and insurrection, the foundation. This movement of 1832 had, in its rapid outbreak and in its melancholy extinction, so much grandeur that even those who see in it only an uprising never refer to it otherwise than with respect. For them, it is like a relic of 1830. Excited imaginations, say they, are not to be calmed in a day. A revolution cannot be cut off short. It must needs undergo some undulations before it returns to a state of rest, like a mountain sinking into the plain. There are no Alps without their Jura, nor Pyrenees without the Asturias. This pathetic crisis of contemporary history, which the memory of Parisians calls the epoch of the riots, is certainly a characteristic hour amid the stormy hours of this century. A last word before we enter on the recital. The facts which we are about to relate belong to that dramatic and living reality which the historian sometimes neglects for lack of time and space. There, nevertheless, we insist upon it, is life, palpitation, human tremor. Petty details, as we think we have already said, are, so to speak, the foliage of great events, and are lost in the distance of history. The epoch, surnamed of the riots, abounds in details of this nature. Judicial inquiries have not revealed, and perhaps have not sounded the depths, for another reason than history. We shall therefore bring to light, among the known and published peculiarities, things which have not heretofore been known, about facts over which have passed the forgetfulness of some, and the death of others. The majority of the actors in these gigantic scenes have disappeared, beginning with the very next day they held their peace, but of what we shall relate, we shall be able to say, "We have seen this." We alter a few names, for history relates and does not inform against, but the deed which we shall paint will be genuine. In accordance with the conditions of the book which we are now writing, We shall show only one side and one episode, and certainly the least known at that, of the 2 days, the 5th and the 6th of June, 1832, but we shall do it in such wise that the reader may catch a glimpse, beneath the gloomy veil which we are about to lift, of the real form of this frightful public adventure. End of Book 10, Chapter 2. Recording by Caitlin Tetmeyer, Emos, Philippines, www.caitlynisher.xanga.com.
Chapter 3 of Book 10 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Kuiper. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Elizabeth Florence Hapgood, Book 10, the 5th of June, 1832. Chapter 3. A Burial. An occasion to be born again. In the spring of 1832, although the cholera had been chilling all minds for the last 3 months, and had cast over their agitation an indescribable and gloomy pacification, Paris had already long been ripe for commotion. As we have said, the great city resembles a piece of artillery. When it is loaded, it suffices for a spark to fall, and the shot is discharged. In June, 1832, the spark was the death of General Lamarck. Lamarck was a man of renown and of action. He had had in succession, under the Empire and under the Restoration, the sorts of bravery requisite for the 2 epochs, the bravery of the battlefield and the bravery of the tribune. He was as eloquent as he had been valiant. A sword was discernible in his speech. Like Foy, his predecessor, after upholding the command, he upheld liberty. He sat between the left and the extreme left, beloved of the people because he accepted the chances of the future, beloved of the populace because he had served the emperor well. He was, in company with Comte Gérard and Hooray, one of Napoleon's marshals in petto. The treaties of 1815 removed him as a personal offense. He hated Wellington with a downright hatred which pleased the multitude, and for 17 years he majestically preserved the sadness of Waterloo, paying hardly any attention to intervening events. In his death agony, at his last hour, he clasped to his breast a sword which had been presented to him by the officers of the 100 Days. Napoleon had died uttering the word army, Lamarck uttering the word country. His death, which was expected, was dreaded by the people as a loss, and by the government as an occasion. This death was an affliction. Like everything that is bitter, affliction may turn to revolt. This is what took place. Certain well-known leaders were going the rounds, that is to say, running from one house to another to collect their men. At Barthélemy's, near the Barrière du Trône, at Capel's, near the Petit Chapeau, the drinkers accosted each other with a grave air. They were heard to say, "Have you your pistol?" "Under my blouse." "And you?" "Under my shirt." In the Rue Traversière, in front of the Bland workshop, and in the yard of the Maison Brûlée, in front of toolmakers Bernière's, groups whispered together. Among them was observed a certain Mavot, who never remained more than a week in one shop, as the masters always discharged him, because they were obliged to dispute with him every day. Mavot was killed the following day, at the barricade of the Rue Ménilmontant. Prétot, who was destined to perish also in the struggle, and to the question, "What is your object?" he replied, "Insurrection." Workmen assembled at the corner of the Rue de Bercy waited for a certain Lemarin, the revolutionary agent for the Faubourg Saint-Marceau. Watchwords were exchanged almost publicly. On the 5th of June, accordingly, a day of mingled rain and sun, General Lamarck's funeral procession traversed Paris with official military pomp, somewhat augmented through precaution. 2 battalions with draped drums and reversed arms, 10,000 National Guards with their swords at their sides, escorted the coffin. The hearse was drawn by young men. The officers of the Invalides came immediately behind it, bearing laurel branches. Then came an innumerable strange agitated multitude, the sectionaires of the Friends of the People, the law school, the medical school, refugees of all nationalities and Spanish, Italian, German and Polish flags, tricolored horizontal banners, every possible sort of banner, children waving green boughs, stone cutters and carpenters who were on strike at the moment, printers who were recognizable by their paper caps, marched 2 by 2, 3 by 3, uttering cries, nearly all of them brandishing sticks, some brandishing sabres, without order and yet with a single soul. Now a tumultuous rout, again a column. Squads chose themselves leaders. A man armed with a pair of pistols in full view seemed to pass the host in review, and the files separated before him. On the side alleys of the boulevards, in the branches of the trees, on balconies, in windows, on the roofs swarmed the heads of men, women, and children. All eyes were filled with anxiety. An armed throng was passing, and a terrified throng looked on. The government on its side was taking observations. It observed with its hand on its sword. 4 squadrons of carabineers could be seen at the Place Louis XV, in their saddles, with their trumpets at their head, cartridge boxes filled, and muskets loaded, all in readiness to march. In the Latin country and in the Jardin des Plantes, the municipal guard echeloned from street to street. At the Halle aux Vins, a squadron of dragoons. At the Grève, half of the 12th Light Infantry, the other half being at the Bastille. The 6th Dragoons at the Célestins, and the courtyard of the Louvre full of artillery. The remainder of the troops were confined to their barracks, without reckoning the regiments of the environs of Paris. Power being uneasy, held suspended over the menacing multitude 24,000 soldiers in the city and 30,000 in the banlieue. Divers reports were in circulation in the cortège. Legitimist tricks were hinted at. They spoke of the Duc de Reichstadt, whom God had marked out for death at that very moment when the populace were designating him for the empire. One personage, whose name has remained unknown, announced that at a given hour 2 overseers who had been won over would throw open the doors of a factory of arms to the people. That which predominated on the uncovered brows of the majority of those present was enthusiasm mingled with dejection. Here and there also, in that multitude given over to such violent but noble emotions, there were visible genuine visages of criminals and ignoble mouths which said, "Let us plunder." There are certain agitations which stir up the bottoms of marshes and make clouds of mud rise through the water, a phenomenon to which well-drilled policemen are no strangers. The procession proceeded with feverish slowness from the house of the deceased by way of the boulevards as far as the Bastille. It rained from time to time. The rain mattered nothing to that throng. Many incidents. The coffin borne round the Vendôme column. Stones thrown at the Duc de Fitz James, who was seen on a balcony with his hat on his head. The Gallic cock torn from a popular flag and dragged in the mire. A policeman wounded with a blow from a sword at the Porte Saint-Martin. An officer of the 12th Light Infantry saying aloud, "I am a Republican." The Polytechnic School coming up unexpectedly against orders to remain at home. The shouts of "Long live the Polytechnique! Long live the Republic!" marked the passage of the funeral train. At the Bastille, long lines of curious and formidable people who descended from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine effected a junction with the procession, and a certain terrible seething began to agitate the throng. One man was heard to say to another, Do you see that fellow with the red beard? He's the one who will give the word when we are to fire." It appears that this red beard was present at another riot, the Quénisset affair, entrusted with this same function. The hearse passed the Bastille, traversed the small bridge, and reached the esplanade of the bridge of Austerlitz. There it halted. The crowd, surveyed at that moment with a bird's eye view, would have presented the aspect of a comet, whose head was on the esplanade and whose tail spread out over the Quai Bourdon, covered the Bastille, and was prolonged on the boulevard as far as the Porte Saint Martin. A circle was traced around the hearse. The vast rout held its peace. Lafayette spoke and bade Lamarck farewell. This was a touching and august instant. All heads uncovered, all hearts beat high. All at once, a man on horseback, clad in black, made his appearance in the middle of the group with a red flag, others say with a pike surmounted with a red liberty cap. Lafayette turned his head. Excelmans quitted the procession. This red flag raised a storm and disappeared in the midst of it. From the boulevard Bourdon to the bridge of Austerlitz, one of those clamors which resemble billows stirred the multitude. Two prodigious shouts went up. "Lamarck to the Pantheon! Lafayette to the town hall!" Some young men, amid the declamations of the throng, harnessed themselves and began to drag Lamarck in the hearse across the bridge of Austerlitz, and Lafayette in a hackneyed coach along the Quai Morland. In the crowd which surrounded and cheered Lafayette, it was noticed that a German showed himself named Ludwig Snyder, who died a centenarian afterwards, who had also been in the war of 1776, and who had fought at Trenton under Washington and at Brandywine under Lafayette. In the meantime, the municipal cavalry on the left bank had been set in motion and came to bar the bridge. On the right bank, the dragoons emerged from the Célestins and deployed along the Quai Morland. The men who were dragging Lafayette suddenly caught sight of them at the corner of the quay and shouted, "The dragoons!" The dragoons advanced at a walk, in silence, with their pistols in their holsters, their swords in their scabbards, their guns slung in their leather sockets, with an air of gloomy expectation. They halted 200 paces from the little bridge. The carriage in which sat Lafayette advanced to them, their ranks opened and allowed it to pass, and then closed behind it. At that moment, the dragoons and the crowd touched. The women fled in terror. What took place during that fatal minute? No one can say. It is the dark moment when two clouds come together. Some declare that a blast of trumpets sounding the charge was heard in the direction of the arsenal. Others that a blow from a dagger was given by a child to a dragoon. The fact is that 3 shots were suddenly discharged. The first killed Cholet, chief of the squadron. The second killed an old deaf woman who was in the act of closing her window. The third singed the shoulder of an officer. A woman screamed, "They are beginning too soon!" And all at once a squadron of dragoons which had remained in the barracks up to this time was seen to debouch at a gallop, with bared swords, through the Rue Bassompierre and the Boulevard Bourdon, sweeping all before them. Then all is said. The tempest is loosed. Stones rain down. A fusillade breaks forth. Many precipitate themselves to the bottom of the bank, and pass the small arm of the Seine, now filled in, the timber yard of the Île Louvrière, that vast citadel ready to hand, bristle with combatants. Stakes are torn up, pistol shots fired, a barricade begun. The young men who are thrust back pass the Austerlitz bridge with the hearse at a run, and the municipal guard, the carabineers, rush up. The dragoons ply their swords. The crowd disperses in all directions. A rumor of war flies to all 4 quarters of Paris. Men shout, "To arms!" They run, tumble down, flee, resist. Wrath spreads abroad the riot, as wind spreads a fire. End of Book 10, Chapter 3. Chapters 4 and 5 of Book 10 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Kuiper. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Elizabeth Florence Hapgood. Book 10, the 5th of June, 1832, Chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4. The Ebullitions of Former Days. Nothing is more extraordinary than the first breaking out of a riot. Everything burst forth everywhere at once. Was it foreseen? Yes. Was it prepared? No. Whence comes it? From the pavements. Whence falls it? From the clouds. Here insurrection assumes the character of a plot, there of an improvisation. The first comer seizes a current of the throng and leads it whither he wills, a beginning full of terror in which is mingled a sort of formidable gaiety. First come clamors, the shops are closed, the displays of the merchants disappear. Then come isolated shots, people flee. Blows from gunstocks beat against porte cochère. Servants can be heard laughing in the courtyards of houses and saying, "There's going to be a row." A quarter of an hour had not elapsed when this is what was taking place in 20 different spots in Paris at once. In the Rue Sainte-Croix de la Bretonnerie, 20 young men, bearded and with long hair, entered a dram shop, and emerged a moment later carrying a horizontal tricolored flag covered with crape, and having at their head 3 men armed, one with a sword, one with a gun, and the third with a pike. In the Rue des Nonandières, a very well-dressed bourgeois who had a prominent belly, a sonorous voice, a bald head, a lofty brow, a black beard, and one of those stiff moustaches which will not lie flat, offered cartridges publicly to passers-by. In the Rue Saint-Pierre-Montmartre, men with bare arms carried about a black flag, on which could be read in white letters this inscription: Republic or Death. In the Rue des Jeuneurs, Rue de Cadran, Rue de Montorgueil, Rue Mandar, groups appeared waving flags on which could be distinguished in gold letters the word section with a number. One of these flags was red and blue with an almost imperceptible stripe of white between. They pillaged a factory of small arms on the Boulevard Saint-Martin and 3 armorers' shops, the first in the Rue Beaubourg, the second in the Rue Michel le Comte, the other in the Rue du Temple. In a few minutes the 1,000 hands of the crowd had seized and carried off 230 guns, nearly all double-barreled, 64 swords, and 83 pistols. In order to provide more arms, one man took the gun, the other the bayonet. Opposite the Quai de la Grève, young men armed with muskets installed themselves in the houses of some women for the purpose of firing. One of them had a flintlock. They rang, entered, and set about making cartridges. One of these women relates, "I did not know what cartridges were. It was my husband who told me." One cluster broke into a curiosity shop in the Rue des Villes Haudriettes and seized yataghans and Turkish arms. The body of a mason who had been killed by a gunshot lay in the Rue de la Perle. And then on the right bank, the left bank, on the quays, on the boulevards, in the Latin country, in the Quartier de Halles, panting men, artisans, students, members of sections read proclamations and shouted, "To arms!" broke street lanterns, unharnessed carriages, unpaved the street, broke into doors of houses, uprooted trees, rummaged cellars, rooted out hogsheads, heaped up paving stones, rough slabs, furniture and planks, and made barricades. They forced the bourgeois to assist them in this. They entered the dwellings of women. They forced them to hand over the swords and guns of their absent husbands. And they wrote on the door with writing, "The arms have been delivered." Some signed their names to receipts for the guns and swords and said, "Send for them tomorrow at the mayor's office." They disarmed isolated sentinels and National Guardsmen in the streets on their way to the town hall. They tore the epaulets from officers. In the Rue du Cimetière Saint-Nicolas, an officer of the National Guard, on being pursued by a crowd armed with clubs and foils, took refuge with difficulty in a house, whence he was only able to emerge at nightfall and in disguise. In the Quartier Saint-Jacques, the students swarmed out of their hotels and ascended the Rue Saint-Hyacinthe to the Café du Progrès, or descended to the Café des Sept Billards in the Rue des Mathurines. There, in front of the door, young men mounted on the stone corner posts distributed arms. They plundered the timber yard in the Rue Transnonain in order to obtain material for barricades. On a single point the inhabitants resisted, at the corner of the Rue Sainte-Avoye and the Rue Simon Lefranc, where they destroyed the barricade with their own hands. At a single point the insurgents yielded. They abandoned a barricade begun in the Rue du Temple, after having fired on a detachment of the National Guard, and fled through the Rue de la Cordière. The detachment picked up in the barricades a red flag, a package of cartridges, and 300 pistol balls. The National Guardsmen tore up the flag and carried off its tattered remains on the points of their bayonets. All that we are here relating slowly and successively took place simultaneously at all points in the city in the midst of a vast tumult, like a mass of tongues of lightning in one clap of thunder. In less than an hour 27 barricades sprang out of the earth in the Quartier of the Halles alone. In the centre was that famous house, Numero 50, which was the fortress of Jeanne and her 600 companions, and which, flanked on the one hand by the barricade at Saint-Merry, and on the other by the barricade of the Rue Maubuée, commanded 3 streets, the Rue des Arcis, the Rue Saint-Martin, and the Rue Aubry-le-Boucher, which it faced. The barricades at right angles fell back, the one of the Rue Montorgueil on the Grande Truanderie, the other of the Rue Geoffroy Langevin on the Rue Sainte-Avoye, without reckoning innumerable barricades in 20 other quarters of Paris, in the Marais, in the Mont Sainte-Geneviève, one in the Rue Ménilmontagne, where was visible a porte cochère torn from its hinges, another near the little bridge of the Hôtel Dieu, made with an écossais, which had been unharnessed and overthrown 300 paces from the Prefecture of Police. At the barricade of the Rue des Ménétriers, a well-dressed man distributed money to the workmen. At the barricade of the Rue Grenetat, a horseman made his appearance and handed to the one who seemed to be the commander of the barricade what had the appearance of a roll of silver. "Here," said he, "this is to pay expenses, wine, etc." A light-haired young man without a cravat went from barricade to barricade carrying passwords. Another, with a naked sword, a blue police cap on his head, placed sentinels. In the interior, beyond the barricades, the wine shops and porters' lodges were converted into guard-houses. Otherwise, the riot was conducted after the most scientific military tactics. The narrow, uneven, sinuous streets, full of angles and turns, were admirably chosen. The neighborhood of the Halles, in particular, a network of streets more intricate than a forest. The Society of the Friends of the People had, it was said, undertaken to direct the insurrection in the Quartier Sainte-Avoye. A man killed in the Rue de Ponceau, who was searched, had on his person a plan of Paris. That which had really undertaken the direction of the uprising was a sort of strange impetuosity which was in the air. The insurrection had abruptly built barricades with one hand, and with the other seized nearly all the posts of the garrison. In less than 3 hours, like a train of powder catching fire, the insurgents had invaded and occupied, on the right bank, the Arsenal, the mayoralty of the Place Royale, the whole of the Marais, the Popincourt arms manufactory, La Galiote, the Château d'Eau, and all the streets near the Halles. On the left bank, the barracks of the veterans, Saint-Pélagie, the Place Maubert, the powder magazine of the Deux Moulins, and all the barriers. At 5 o'clock in the evening they were masters of the Bastille, of the Lingerie, of the Blanc-Manteau. Their scouts had reached the Place des Victoires and menaced the Bank, the Petit Père barracks, and the post office. A third of Paris was in the hands of the rioters. The conflict had been begun on a gigantic scale at all points, and, as a result of the disarming domiciliary visits and the armorers' shops hastily invaded, was that the combat which had begun with the throwing of stones was continued with gunshots. About 6 o'clock in the evening, the Passage du Saumon became the field of battle. The uprising was at one end, the troops were at the other. They fired from one gate to the other. An observer, a dreamer, the author of this book, who had gone to get a near view of this volcano, found himself in the passage between the two fires. All that he had to protect him from the bullets was the swell of the two half columns which separate the shops. He remained in this delicate situation for nearly half an hour. Meanwhile, the call to arms was beaten. The National Guard armed in haste, the legions emerged from the mayoralties, the regiments from their barracks. Opposite the Passage de l'Ancre, a drummer received a blow from a dagger. Another, in the Rue de Seine, was assailed by 30 young men who broke his instrument and took away his sword. Another was killed in the Rue Grenier Saint-Lazare. In the Rue Michel Comte, 3 officers fell dead one after the other. Many of the municipal guards, on being wounded in the Rue des Lombards, retreated. In front of the Cour Batave, a detachment of National Guards found a red flag bearing the following inscription: Republican Revolution, numero 127. Was this a revolution in fact? The insurrection had made of the center of Paris a sort of inextricable, tortuous, colossal citadel. There was the hearth. There, evidently, was the question. All the rest was nothing but skirmishes. The proof that all would be decided there lay in the fact that there was no fighting going on there as yet. In some regiments the soldiers were uncertain, which added to the fearful uncertainty of the crisis. They recalled the popular ovation which had greeted the neutrality of the 53rd of the line in July, 1830. 2 intrepid men tried in great wars. The Marshal Lobau and General Bugeaud were in command. Bugeaud under Lobau. Enormous patrols, composed of battalions of the line, enclosed in entire companies of the National Guard, and preceded by a commissary of police wearing his scarf of office, went to reconnoiter the streets in rebellion. The insurgents, on their side, placed vedettes at the corners of all open spaces, and audaciously sent their patrols outside the barricades. Each side was watching the other. The government, with an army in its hand, hesitated. The night was almost upon them, and the Saint Merry tocsin began to make itself heard. The minister of war at that time, Marshal Soult, who had seen Austerlitz, regarded this with a gloomy air. These old sailors, accustomed to correct maneuvers and having as resource and guide only tactics, that compass of battles, are utterly disconcerted in the presence of that immense foam which is called public wrath. The National Guards of the suburbs rushed up in haste and disorder. A battalion of the 12th Light came at a run from Saint-Denis. The 14th of the line arrived from Courbevoie. The batteries of the military school had taken up their positions on the Carrousel. Cannons were descending from Vincennes. Solitude was formed around the Tuileries. Louis Philippe was perfectly serene. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Originality of Paris. During the last 2 years, as we have said, Paris had witnessed more than one insurrection. Nothing is generally more singularly calm than the physiognomy of Paris during an uprising beyond the bounds of the rebellious quarters. Paris very speedily accustoms herself to anything. It is only a riot, and Paris has so many affairs on hand that she does not put herself out for so small a matter. These colossal cities alone can offer such spectacles. These immense enclosures alone can contain at the same time civil war and an odd and indescribable tranquillity. Ordinarily, when an insurrection commences, when the shopkeeper hears the drum, the call to arms, the general alarm, he contents himself with the remark, "There appears to be a squabble in the Rue Saint-Martin," or "in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine." Often he adds carelessly, "or somewhere in that direction." Later on, when the heartrending and mournful hubbub of musketry and firing by platoons becomes audible, the shopkeeper says, "It's getting hot. Hello, it's getting hot." A moment later the riot approaches and gains in force. He shuts up his shop precipitously, hastily dons his uniform, that is to say, he places his merchandise in safety and risks his own person. Men fire in a square, in a passage, in a blind alley. They take and retake the barricade. Blood flows. The grape shot riddles the fronts of houses. The balls kill people in their beds. Corpses encumber the streets. A few streets away, the shock of billiard balls can be heard in the cafés. The theaters open their doors and present vaudevilles. The curious laugh and chat a couple of paces distant from these streets filled with war. Hackney carriages go their way, passers-by are going to a dinner somewhere in town, sometimes in the very quarter where the fighting is going on. In 1831 a fusillade was stopped to allow a wedding party to pass. At the time of the insurrection of 1839 in the Rue Saint-Martin, a little infirm old man pushing a handcart surmounted by a tricolored rag, in which he had carafes filled with some sort of liquid, went and came from barricade to troops and from troops to the barricade, offering his glasses of cocoa impartially, now to the government, now to anarchy. Nothing can be stranger, and this is the peculiar character of uprisings in Paris, which cannot be found in any other capital. To this end, two things are requisite: the size of Paris and its gaiety. The city of Voltaire and Napoleon is necessary. On this occasion, however, in the resort to arms of June 25th, 1832, the great city felt something which was, perhaps, stronger than itself. It was afraid. Closed doors, windows, and shutters were to be seen everywhere, in the most distant and most disinterested quarters. The courageous took to arms, the poltroons hid. The busy and heedless passers-by disappeared. Many streets were empty at 4 o'clock in the morning. Alarming details were hawked about, fatal news was disseminated. That they were masters of the bank, that there were 600 of them in the cloister of Saint Merry alone, entrenched and embattled in the church. That the line was not to be depended on, that Armand Carrel had been to see Marshal Clausel, and that the marshal had said, "Get a regiment first." That Lafayette was ill, but that he had said to them nevertheless, "I am with you, I will follow you wherever there is room for a chair." That one must be on one's guard, that at night there would be people pillaging isolated dwellings in the deserted corners of Paris. There the imagination of the police, that Anne Radcliffe mixed up with the government, was recognizable. That a battery had been established in the Rue Aubry-le-Boucher. That Lobau and Bugeaud were putting their heads together, and that at midnight, or at daybreak at latest, 4 columns would march simultaneously on the centre of the uprising, the first coming from the Bastille, the second from the Porte Saint-Martin, the third from the Grève, the fourth from the Halles, that perhaps also the troops would evacuate Paris and withdraw to the Champs de Mars. That no one knew what would happen, but that this time it certainly was serious. People busied themselves over Marshal Soult's hesitations. Why did he not attack at once? It is certain that he was profoundly absorbed. The old lion seemed to scent an unknown monster in that gloom. Evening came, the theatres did not open. The patrols circulated with an air of irritation. Passers-by were searched. Suspicious persons were arrested. By 9 o'clock, more than 800 persons had been arrested. The Prefecture of Police was encumbered with them. So was the Conciergerie. So was La Force. At the Conciergerie in particular, the long vault, which is called the Rue de Paris, was littered with trusses of straw, upon which lay a heap of prisoners, whom the man of Lyons, Lagrange, harangued valiantly. All that straw, rustled by all these men, produced the sound of a heavy shower. Elsewhere, prisoners slept in the open air in the meadows, piled on top of each other. Anxiety reigned everywhere, and a certain tremor, which was not habitual with Paris. People barricaded themselves in their houses. Wives and mothers were uneasy. Nothing was to be heard but this: "Ah, my God, he has not come home!" There was hardly even the distant rumble of a vehicle to be heard. People listened on their thresholds to the rumors, the shouts, the tumult, the dull and indistinct sounds, to the things that were said. "It is the cavalry," or "Those are the caissons galloping," to the trumpets, the drums, the firing, and above all, to that lamentable alarm peal from Saint Merry. They waited for the first cannon shot. Men sprang up at the corners of the streets and disappeared shouting, "Go home!" and people made haste to bolt their doors. They said, "How will all this end?" From moment to moment, in proportion as the darkness descended, Paris seemed to take on a more mournful hue from the formidable flaming of the revolt. End of Book 10, Chapters 4 and 5.